There are towns that keep secrets the way a dry riverbed keeps water, not well and not forever. The silence just looks like nothing's there until the season changes and everything that was buried comes rushing out at once. Del Rio, Texas, knew how to be quiet. It had been practicing for years. The morning light was still thin when the man placed the documents on the counter. He did it slowly, the way a person sets something down when they know there's no taking it back. Both hands, both sheets of paper, side by side on the dark wood of the county clerk's counter, like two halves of a sentence that had taken 6 years to finish. The room had maybe 8 people in it. Within 30 seconds, nobody breathed. At the far end of the counter stood a young woman, 21 years old, black hair loose over her shoulders, arms folded across her chest in the way someone crosses their arms when they are not asking for comfort, but refusing to allow for the possibility of collapse. She looked at the documents. She looked at the man who had placed them there. She did not look away. She did not blink. Mr. Cavett, the clerk, picked up the first sheet and read it. His face changed. He put it down and picked up the second. His face changed again. He looked at the man across the counter, at the lined face, the gray at the temples, the badge that was no longer there, and for a long moment he simply held the paper in his hands, unsure of what a man is supposed to do when a debt this old gets paid in full, in public, in front of witnesses. Nobody in Del Rio had seen anything like it. Nobody in Del Rio had done anything to prevent the thing that made it necessary. That was the part that would take them longer to sit with. To understand what Elias Cord placed on that counter, you have to go back 6 years. He had been drinking coffee at a corner table in the Morales boarding house on a Tuesday in late April, when Marshal Holt Desmond walked through the door. Elias was 52 years old. His left knee had been giving him trouble since a bad fall off a horse in the winter of '74, and on cold mornings, which in Del Rio meant any morning before 8 o'clock from October through May, the joint announced itself with a grinding ache that started below the kneecap and worked its way up into something that felt like low-grade shame. He had learned not to favor it. Favoring a bad leg in this part of Texas was the kind of thing men noticed and filed away. He was no longer a ranger, had not been for 2 years. His days had the particular shapelessness of a man who has finished the work that defined him and not yet found out what comes next, if anything does. He woke early, drank his coffee black, read whatever newspapers arrived on the southbound stage, and tried not to think about the way the silence in a room could start to feel like a verdict if you sat in it long enough. The knee hurt. The coffee was hot. The morning was otherwise unremarkable. Then Desmond came in. The marshal was a broad man with a deliberate way of moving through a room. Not hurried, but not uncertain either, the way a man moves when he expects the room to accommodate him and has rarely been disappointed. He pulled out the chair across from Elias without asking. He set his hat on the table. He looked at Elias for a moment, the way a man looks at a piece of equipment he needs to use one more time. "I have an arrangement that requires a man with your standing," Desmond said. "I don't have a standing," Elias said. "I turned in the badge." "Your name still means something in this county." "My name means I'm old enough to know better than most conversations that start this way." Desmond smiled without much warmth in it. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. Government seal at the top. A woman's name written in ink that still looked fresh. He set it on the table between them. "There's a young woman," he said. "Apache. She's been living at the edge of county jurisdiction for 18 months now. No papers, no legal status, no guardian of record." He let that land for a moment. "The federal office in San Antonio has been patient. They won't stay patient." Elias did not touch the document. "What does that have to do with me? If she marries a citizen in good standing, a man the county knows, a man with a record of service, she gets legal residency. She stays. She doesn't get shipped to the reservation in New Mexico territory." Desmond leaned back. "You're not married. You've got the standing. The marriage is legal, but not—" He paused, searching for the word. "Not more than what it needs to be. You'd be doing a civic duty." Elias looked at the name on the document. Nahla Serrano, age 21. He looked at it long enough that Desmond shifted in his chair. "She agreed to this," Elias said. It was not quite a question. Desmond picked up his hat from the table. "She understands the alternative." That was all he said. He stood, settled a hat onto his head, and walked back out the way he came, unhurried, untroubled, a man who had completed the easy part of a task and left the complicated part on someone else's table. Elias sat with the document for a while. He drank the rest of his coffee, which had gone cold. His knee ached. Outside, Del Rio went on about its morning. The sound of a wagon on packed dirt, the distant bark of a dog, the thin, high call of someone's child. He thought about civic duty. He thought about what a man says yes to when the alternative for someone else is worse than the inconvenience for him. He thought, without meaning to, about a name, a family name, a piece of land east of town, a morning 6 years ago that he had spent the better part of every night since trying not to reconstruct in detail. He didn't think about it long. He folded the document and put it in his coat pocket. He left a coin for the coffee. He got up slowly, favoring the knee despite himself, and walked toward the door. He did not ask what she wanted. That was his second mistake in the story of Nahla Serrano. The first had come 6 years earlier in a field at dawn when he was younger, and the cost of speaking up had seemed too high. Some debts can't be paid in the year they were made. The ceremony was held at the county clerk's office on a Thursday morning, 7 minutes from start to finish. Nahla Serrano arrived in a dress that did not belong to her, a borrowed thing, pale blue, slightly too large at the shoulders. Her hair was pulled back. Her shoes were her own, brown leather boots, worn at the heel, the kind of boots a person walks a long way in. She walked in alone. She stood where Cavett told her to stand. She answered when she was asked to answer. She did not look at the men in the room the way a woman looks when she wants something from them. She looked at the floor, but her hands at her sides slightly curled, the knuckles showing white through the brown of her skin. Her hands told a different story. And if any of the 4 men in that room had been paying the kind of attention a person pays when something important is happening in front of them, they might have understood it. They weren't paying that kind of attention. Elias stood beside her. He was a head taller. He could smell the cedar in the room, the old paper smell of county records, and something else, wood smoke and something like dried grass, that he understood was coming from her, from whatever life she had been living at the edge of the jurisdiction for the last 18 months. He looked straight ahead, the way a man does when he knows that looking at someone would require him to see them. Nobody in the room said anything that did not need to be said. Nobody smiled. The town of Del Rio had known, in the way a small town always knows, what was coming. Some of them had heard the name Serrano and understood enough of the history to feel the shape of what was happening. None of them had said anything, not to Desmond, not to Elias, not to each other, not in any way that mattered. They kept the quiet the way they always kept it, not because they approved of what was being done, but because speaking up had a price, and silence was free. 7 minutes. It was over. Elias Cord and Nahla Serrano walked out of the county clerk's office into the April heat and stood for a moment on the wooden sidewalk, side by side, two strangers with the same last name and absolutely nothing else in common, except, though neither of them knew it yet, the same wound, the same piece of land, and the same name in a file that Elias had signed 6 years ago and Nahla had carried in the sole of her boot ever since. The sun was already high. Somewhere down the street, a child laughed. Neither of them moved toward it. Elias put his hat on. Nahla looked east, the direction of the Serrano ranch, the way a person looks at something they cannot see but know is there. And then she looked away. She had not said a single unnecessary word since she walked through the door. She would not say one now. But that night, in the narrow room next to his at the Morales boarding house, the sound of her setting down her boots on the wooden floor, one, then two, the careful, particular weight of them, told Elias that she had not given up. Whatever she was carrying, it was still hers. Whatever she was waiting for, she was still waiting. He lay awake on his cot, with the silence pressing in around him, and thought, as he always did sooner or later, no matter how far he'd walked from it, about the morning of October the 3rd, 1871, and a rancho east of Del Rio, and a boy who had stood in the door of a stone house and refused to come out. He thought about what he had done and what he hadn't. What was the wedding gift that silenced an entire town? That question had an answer. But to understand it, to understand why a man who had nothing left would give away the last thing he owned in front of witnesses, you'd first have to understand what it costs a person to carry a wrong for 6 years without ever speaking its name. Elias was about to find out that the name had been in the room with him all along. The Morales boarding house had 6 rooms. Nahla had been given the one at the end of the hall, the one Mrs. Morales kept for long-stay guests, with a window that faced east and a latch on the door that didn't quite catch, unless you lifted the handle while you turned it. Mrs. Morales had showed her the trick with a kind of apologetic efficiency, the way a woman shows you something broken in her home when she would rather not discuss why she hasn't fixed it. Nahla had nodded and said thank you, and meant it. A room with a window that faced east was not nothing. Elias was in the room next to hers. There had been no discussion of this. It was simply the arrangement, a married couple, adjoining rooms, a boarding house that required no explanation from either of them as long as the rent was paid on time. Mrs. Morales had pressed her lips together in a thin line when Desmond had made the reservation on their behalf, and she had said nothing to either of them that wasn't strictly necessary, which Nahla understood to be a form of decency. Some people showed you what they couldn't bring themselves to say by carefully not saying it. She lay on the cot that night, the dress that wasn't hers folded over the chair, her own clothes back on, her boots set by the door, and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. The creak of old wood in the heat, the far-off low of cattle from somewhere south, the particular quality of silence that comes from a town that has agreed, without announcement, to stop paying attention. She had not cried. She had wanted to. The wanting had been there since the moment Desmond had explained the arrangement to her 3 days earlier, in the same flat official tone a man uses when he wants you to understand that your feelings about a thing are not relevant to its outcome. She had sat across from him in the county office with her hands folded on her lap and let him speak. And when he was finished, she had said, "And if I don't?" And he had looked at her the way a man looks at a question he expected and prepared for, and said, "The Territory Office in Santa Fe has already processed the paperwork for relocation. New Mexico, far side of the mountains." He let that sit for a moment. You wouldn't be close enough to do anything about the land claim, even if you found new grounds. He picked up his hat. "I'd take the week to think it over." She had not needed a week. She had not said yes either. She had said, "When?" And Desmond had taken that for agreement, which was the calculation she had intended him to make. In the dark of the east-facing room, Nahla stared at the ceiling and thought about the difference between surrender and strategy. Her mother had explained it to her once, not in those words, because her mother had not been a woman who used the words of one world to describe the truths of another, but the meaning had been clear enough. You bend when the wind is stronger than you are. You do not break. Bending is not the same as breaking. And when the wind passes, and it always passes, you are still standing, and it is not. Bending is not breaking. She had said yes to a 7-minute ceremony in a room that smelled of old ledgers and cedar polish, with a man she did not know, in a dress that belonged to someone else. She had done it with her hands curled at her sides and her eyes on the floor, not because she was afraid, because she was counting. There is a difference, and it matters. The first morning, she came downstairs to breakfast before he did. Mrs. Morales had set 2 places at the small table by the window: coffee, bread, salt pork, a dish of something preserved in a dark syrup that Nahla did not recognize. She sat, poured her own coffee, and looked out at the street. Del Rio was already awake. A man was loading sacks onto a flatbed wagon. 2 women stood in conversation in front of the dry goods store, not yet open. The sun cutting low and sharp across the tops of the buildings and making everything look more certain than it was. She heard him on the stairs before she saw him. The slow, deliberate descent, the slight hesitation at the bottom step that she recognized now as the bad knee, the way a body announces its history before its face does. He came in, saw her, and stopped for just a moment in the doorway. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat. He poured his coffee. He looked out the window. He did not say good morning, which she found unexpectedly easier to be in the room with than if he had. They sat in silence for several minutes. The pork was not bad. The bread was old, but edible. She ate with the deliberate attention of a person who has learned not to take meals for granted, and she noticed, without particularly trying to, that he ate the same way. It was Elias who spoke first. "I can try to find you better arrangements," he said, "if you'd rather not." He paused, choosing the next word with the care of a man who has learned that the wrong word in a careful sentence can undo all the care. "If this is not suitable." Nahla looked at him across the table. He was looking at his coffee. "Your English," she said, "is careful. I don't want to say the wrong thing. That's considerate." She set her cup down. "Most men in this county don't bother." He looked up at that, a quick look, measuring, and she met it without moving. "I speak 3 languages," she said. "English better than most of the men in that room yesterday. Spanish better than you, and one that no one in this town has ever bothered to learn, so I won't trouble you with it." She picked up her coffee again. "You were going to say, if this is not suitable, was it suitable for you?" The pause that followed was longer than it needed to be for a man who simply hadn't thought about it. "No," he said, "then we understand each other." She looked back out the window. The 2 women in front of the dry goods store had moved on. The man with the flatbed was gone. Del Rio kept its morning face, ordinary, deliberate, undisturbed, a town that knew how to look at itself in the mirror. "I'm not asking you for anything," she said to the window, more than to him. "I don't expect anything from you. When whatever this is has served its purpose, we can go back to being strangers with different last names." She set the cup down for the final time and stood. "I just need to stay in the county." She pushed the chair in. He hadn't moved. "Why?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. It was the kind of word a man says when he already understands the shape of an answer and wants to see if you trust him enough to give it. She didn't, not yet. "Good morning, Mr. Cord," she said, and she walked out of the room, and he sat with his coffee and the bones of the sentence she hadn't finished and the way she'd said his name, without heat, without softness, with the precise neutrality of a person who has decided to give you exactly as much as you've earned and nothing more. You already know what she felt in that room. You've been in a room where everyone stayed quiet when they should have spoken, where something wrong was done in plain view, and the people who saw it looked away, because looking away was cheaper than what speaking up would have cost them. So had she. So had he. The difference was that she had not chosen the silence. It had been chosen for her, by a government office in San Antonio, by a marshal who used paperwork like other men used rifles, by a town that kept its secrets the way a dry riverbed keeps water. Not well, not forever, just long enough for the damage to be done. She had learned at 15 what it costs a family when the wrong people decide the right to silence belongs to them. She had learned it in the smoke and the shouting and the long, terrible quiet after, when her father sat in the doorway of what was no longer his house and looked east the way a man looks at something he has lost and cannot name a number for. She had learned it, and she had not forgotten the boots she set by the door every night, brown leather worn at the heel, had a small reinforced cavity sewn into the left sole. Her father had done it himself with a needle and a strip of rawhide the summer of 1871, before the men came. He had folded the document to fit the space and pressed it closed and said, "Carry this. Don't let go of this. Whatever happens, don't let them take this from you." She had not let them take it. What she was waiting for, the right moment, the right witness, the right chain of circumstances that could translate one piece of folded paper into a legal claim, was still somewhere ahead of her, still possible, still hers to find. This arrangement with the former ranger was a door she'd walked through because the alternative was losing her proximity to the land entirely, and proximity was everything. You cannot reclaim what you cannot reach. She had done what her mother taught her. She had bent. She had not broken. What Elias Cord did not know, what no one in Del Rio had reason to know, was that she had recognized his name the moment Desmond said it. Not from reputation, not from the ranger's office, from a list. A list her father had written in a small leather notebook the winter after the incursion. The names of every man he had identified, from memory, as present that morning on the Serrano land. He had written it by firelight in a rented room in New Mexico, his hands unsteady, his son already 3 months in the ground. He had written it because a man who has lost everything still has the right to record what was taken from him, and by whom. Elias Cord was fourth on the list. She had been carrying both documents, the land map in the boot, the notebook in the lining of her coat, for 6 years. She walked into that 7-minute ceremony with the man's name against her chest, and she stood beside him, and she said what she was asked to say, and she walked out into the April heat and looked east. She was not done. She had not even started. The question was not whether she could use this. The question was whether the man who had signed the report in 1871 had any idea what she was carrying, and what, if anything, he intended to do about the debt he had been walking around with for 6 years. Because a debt that the debtor won't name is just a weight with no handle, and a weight with no handle is very difficult to put down. The second morning was the same as the first, except that it wasn't. The coffee was the same. The bread was the same. The light through the window hit the table at the same low angle it always did in late April in Del Rio, which was to say it came in sideways and made ordinary things look briefly important before the day warmed up and flattened everything out. What was different was that they had done this before. One breakfast between strangers is an accident. 2 is a pattern. And Nahla Serrano had spent enough of her life reading patterns to know that they were already in one. He was at the table when she came down. He had poured 2 cups. He hadn't done it as a gesture. She understood that immediately. He'd done it the way a man does something that simply seemed logical in the moment, without thinking about what it implied. He didn't look up when she sat. He turned the page of the newspaper he was reading. The second cup sat there, steam rising off the top, waiting with no particular expectation. She sat. She drank the coffee. It was too bitter, but she didn't say so. "There's a registration at the county office," he said, still reading. "For the change of legal status, we need to appear in person, Wednesday." "What time?" 10. She nodded. He didn't see it, but she nodded. They finished breakfast in silence that had, imperceptibly, changed its quality. Not comfortable, not uncomfortable, something more neutral than both. The silence of 2 people who have agreed without saying so to occupy the same space without treating it as a problem. Mrs. Morales watched them from the kitchen doorway with the expression of a woman who had seen enough of life to know that things were never quite what they looked like, and not quite as bad as she'd feared, and also more complicated than she'd ever be able to explain to anyone. Wednesday came with a high white sky and dust on everything. The walk to the county office was 3 blocks. They walked side by side, not quite together and not quite apart. The distance of 2 people who have not yet decided what they are to each other and have the sense to leave the question open. His left knee was slow on the stairs. He didn't acknowledge it. She didn't acknowledge it either. Inside, The county office smelled of paper and iron and the particular airlessness of rooms where other people's problems get filed away. A clerk behind the desk looked at them over a pair of spectacles in the resigned way county clerks look at everything after the first decade, as if the world keeps presenting new arrangements and they have long since run out of surprise. There were forms, there were signatures. There was a pause in which the clerk looked at her name, looked at his, looked at the spaces between, and decided not to ask. Elias answered the questions he was asked. Nahla answered the questions she was asked. They did not look at each other, but at some point, she was not sure exactly when. Elias said something wrong in a form, a small error of phrasing, and the clerk corrected him, and before Elias could respond, Nahla said, in English so precise it landed in the room like a dropped tool. The correct clause is subsection 14 of the Territorial Residency Act of '68. He means a legal resident in continued county presence, not temporary permit status. They are not the same. The clerk blinked. Elias turned to look at her. She was still looking at the clerk. Her expression had not changed. Her hands were folded on the counter with the patience of someone who has said what needed to be said and sees no reason to make more of it. The clerk made the correction. On the street outside, Elias stopped. "You read the territorial statutes." "I read anything I could find about land law in Val Verde County," she said. "I've been reading for 6 years." She didn't look at him. "You thought I didn't know the law." It wasn't quite an accusation. "I didn't think about it," he said. And then, because that was perhaps worse, "That was careless of me." She looked at him then, just briefly, the quick, flat look of a person recalibrating a prior assumption. "Most people don't bother to admit the careless parts," she said. She walked ahead of him, back toward the boarding house. He followed, 3 steps behind, and said nothing for the rest of the walk. His knee hurt. The sun was overhead now. In the distance, somewhere along the river, a hawk called once and went quiet. He had not expected her. That was the thing he found himself thinking in the particular stripped-down way a man thinks when he has nothing left to perform for himself. He had agreed to the arrangement without asking who she was, had sat across the table from Desmond and looked at the name on the document and thought, "Young woman, Apache. Difficult situation. One more thing that the government has made unnecessarily complicated he had not asked, he had not thought to ask." She spoke 3 languages. She knew the law better than the clerk who administered it. She had arrived at the ceremony with her hands curled at her sides and her eyes on the floor, and he had read that as fear, and it wasn't fear at all. He had read her wrong. He had been reading a great many things wrong for a great many years. That night, the boarding house went quiet in the way it always did. The creak of old wood, the distant low sound of the river, the particular hush of a building where everyone has retreated behind their own door. Nahla had gone upstairs after supper without a word. Elias had sat in the small front room for a while, reading nothing, watching the lamp burn down. Mrs. Morales had passed through once, then left him to it. He should have gone to bed. Instead, he sat. There are things a man carries that don't get heavier over time. They just get quieter. The weight stays the same. You simply stop expecting it to lift. He had been carrying this one for 6 years. October 3rd, 1871. The Serrano land, east of Del Rio. The dawn light, the sound of horses, a stone house with a door that someone had refused to open, and the decision, not violent, not dramatic, just the plain, ordinary, awful decision that a man makes when the price of doing the right thing is too high and the price of silence seems, in that particular moment, manageable. He had not pulled a trigger. He had signed his name. A man can tell himself for a long time that those are different things. He had stopped believing it somewhere around the third year. The lamp flickered. Outside, a horse shifted in the livery 2 streets over. The night was warm and dry and full of the particular sounds Del Rio made when it thought no one was listening. And then, from some half-aware place between exhaustion and sleeplessness, he said it, not loudly, not in the way a man chooses to speak, the way a word surfaces when you've been holding it under for too long, when the weight of not saying gets heavier than the weight of the name itself. Serrano. Just the name. Not even a full sentence. More like a door that had been locked for 6 years and had opened itself by a fraction in the dark. He heard nothing from upstairs. He put out the lamp. He went up to bed. He lay on the cot in the familiar attitude of a man who has given up on sleep but stays still out of respect for the possibility of it. And he thought about the name he'd said to no one in an empty room for no reason except that it had finally become too heavy to keep swallowing. He was thinking about Vicente Serrano. He was not thinking about the woman in the room next door. He should have been paying more attention. Nahla had been on the stairs. She had come back down for water. The pitcher in her room had been empty, and she had not wanted to call for Mrs. Morales at that hour. She had heard his voice from the front room, not the words she'd thought at first, just the low sound of a man talking to himself, which was common enough in a boarding house, nothing worth pausing for. But then the words, just the one word. She stood on the 3rd stair from the bottom, her hand on the newel post, and heard the name fall into the silence of the boarding house like a stone dropped into still water. She did not go in. She stood on the stair for a long moment, feeling the wood under her feet and the coolness of the hall around her, and she thought about her father's notebook, the one she carried in the lining of her coat, the pages gone soft from 6 years of being folded and refolded, the names written in his unsteady hand by firelight in a rented room in New Mexico. 4th on the list. She had known his name before she knew his face. She had been carrying it longer than she had been carrying the map. She went back upstairs without the water. She lay on her cot and looked at the ceiling and listened to the sound of the boarding house settling around her, the creak of his floorboards, the familiar weight of his step, the slow, deliberate silence that followed when he finally went still. He had said it in the dark, to no one. He was carrying it too. She did not know what to do with that. A man can carry guilt and still be guilty. The weight of it proves nothing. She had met men in her life who felt terrible about the things they had done and changed nothing, who carried their shame like a trophy. Look how much this cost me, while the people they'd wronged kept paying the real price. But she had also learned from her mother and from the long years after that you could not read a man's past by his present posture. You had to watch what he did with the weight. You had to watch whether he put it down or handed it to someone else. She had been watching Elias cord for 4 days. She had not decided anything, but she was watching more carefully now. One floor below, Elias Cord stared at the ceiling and said nothing, and thought about a morning he would never be able to take back, and for the first time in 6 years found himself wondering whether there was something, anything, left to do with it, except carry it until it was over. The question was the wrong one. He just didn't know that yet. He didn't know she was upstairs, awake, watching the same ceiling and thinking the same question from the other side. He didn't know that she already had half the answer. He didn't know about the boots by her door, or what was sewn into the left sole, or how long she had been carrying the thing that could either destroy him or, if he made the right choice, if he still had it in him to make a right choice, set them both free. He would find out. But not tonight. Tonight, the name had simply escaped him, there in the dark, when he had thought no one was listening. He was wrong about that, too. The third morning brought a summons from the county assessor's office. Not unexpected. Desmond had mentioned there would be additional filings, additional registrations, the slow bureaucratic wake of a legal change of status. Elias found the notice slid under his door and read it twice before going downstairs, turning the words over with the particular attention of a man who has learned that official language almost always means something other than what it says. They walked to the county building again. The same 3 blocks, the same distance kept between them, not quite together, not quite apart. The same high white sky pressing down over the rooftops of Del Rio. The same dust on everything. The same low sound of the river off to the east that you couldn't quite hear, but always knew was there. He had started to notice the way she walked, not the way a man notices a woman. He had enough sense to know that wasn't what this was or what it could afford to be. It was more basic than that. The way a man in the field learns to read the people around him for information. She moved carefully, not slowly, carefully, like someone who had spent years making sure they left no footprint larger than necessary. She kept to the edge of the wooden sidewalk. She let him open doors without appearing to wait for him. She noticed things at eye level and below, door thresholds, wheel ruts in the road, the way a loose board in the floorboards of the county office gave slightly under the 3rd step. He noticed her noticing. He said nothing about it. The assessor's office was in the west wing of the county building, past the land registry. A long, narrow hallway with maps pinned to the walls on both sides. Property divisions, survey charts, the careful gridding of Val Verde County into parcels with names and numbers and boundaries that had been drawn and redrawn over the course of the last 20 years as the federal government worked its way through the slow business of deciding what belonged to whom. Nahla stopped. It was not dramatic, just a pause in her step, half a second, almost invisible. He wouldn't have caught it if he hadn't been watching. Her eyes had moved to the left wall, a survey map from 1869, Val Verde County, eastern parcels. The typography was small and the ink had faded, but the grid was legible, and along the eastern boundary, near the river tributary that the survey called Arroyo Serrano in the older notation. She looked away. She resumed walking. He looked at the same wall. He saw what she had seen. He kept his face as still as a man can keep it when something cold passes through him, and he followed her down the hall, and he said nothing at all. The assessor asked his questions. Elias answered. Nahla provided the documentation she'd been told to bring, her own papers, the ones she had carried since New Mexico, the ones that proved she was who she said she was. But at some point, while the assessor was writing, Elias found himself looking at her hands on the counter, both of them still. And he thought about the map on the wall and the way her step had broken and recovered in the span of a heartbeat, and something assembled itself in the back of his mind that he hadn't been able to put together before. She hadn't come to Del Rio because the government sent her here. She had come back. He looked at her hands on the counter. She did not look at him. They walked back to the boarding house without speaking. Mrs. Morales had left soup warming on the stove. They ate it. The soup was good. Beef, dried chili, something that tasted like it had been slow cooked since that morning. Del Rio was the kind of town where the food was better than everything else about it. Elias put his spoon down. "What was the name of your father's land?" he said. Not quite a question, more like a door pushed gently open. Nahla was still eating. She finished the spoonful she had raised before he spoke. She set it back in the bowl with the precision of someone deciding how to respond to a thing while pretending to be focused on something else. "Rancho Serrano," she said. "East of here." "Yes." "Near the arroyo." A pause. 1 beat. 2. "You know the area?" she said. "I know most of this county," he said. "Worked it for 12 years. She picked up her spoon again. She did not say, "I know you know it." She did not say, "Your name is in a notebook." She did not say, "I have been watching you for 3 years through second-hand accounts, and 1 7-minute ceremony and 4 mornings of coffee and silence, and I am still deciding what you are." She said, "His name was Vicente Serrano." And she went back to her soup. Elias picked up his own spoon. He brought it most of the way to his mouth. The soup was good. He didn't eat it. He held the spoon in the air for a moment, just long enough for the broth to stop steaming. And then he set it back in the bowl very carefully, the way he had set the documents on the counter, the way a person sets something down when they aren't sure yet whether they're done with it. Vicente Serrano. He had heard that name from a man's own mouth once, a long time ago, in a field at dawn, from a distance that could have been crossed if he had crossed it, if he had been a different kind of man, or if the cost of being that kind of man had seemed, in that particular moment, manageable. The soup cooled. Neither of them spoke. Mrs. Morales passed through with a towel over her shoulder, looked at the two of them, looked at the untouched bowls, and went back to the kitchen without saying anything, which was, Elias had come to understand, her highest form of tact. That night, he did not go to the front room. He went straight upstairs. He sat on the edge of the cot. He reached under the cot and pulled out the old leather traveling case, the one he'd carried since the Rangers, the one with the broken latch and the brass corner that had been repaired twice and would need to be repaired again. He set it on the cot beside him and looked at it for a while without opening it. He was 52 years old. He had covered a lot of ground in 52 years, and most of it he did not regret, and some of it he did. And the part he regretted most was not the violence. The violence had been the work, and he had known what the work was when he took it. The part he regretted was the forms he signed, the documents that made official what would otherwise have been just a thing that happened, The reports that turned a morning in the field into a legal record. The signature at the bottom of the page that said, "I was here, I saw this. I affirm that what was done was in accordance with the order." A man can tell himself for a long time that his signature is not his action. He had stopped believing it somewhere around the third year. He opened the latch. Inside the case, a spare shirt, worn thin at the elbows, a folding knife, a letter he had started 3 years ago and never sent, to no one in particular, to the general human record. A set of cartridges he kept out of habit more than need, and at the bottom, folded under the spare shirt, creased at the same 4 points from 6 years of being folded and not unfolded, a piece of paper. He took it out. He did not open it. He held it in both hands, the way you hold a thing when you know what's inside, but you're not sure you're ready to look at it in this particular light, at this particular hour. When you have just heard a woman say her father's name at a supper table in a voice that gave nothing away except the one thing it couldn't contain, the knowledge that it mattered. The paper smelled of old ink and the particular dryness of kept things. He put it back. He closed the case. He slid it under the cot and sat on the edge of the mattress with his hands on his knees and his bad knee aching in the dry heat. And he thought about a family name written in small letters on a faded survey map, and the way a woman's step had broken for half a second in a government hallway. He thought about Vicente Serrano. He thought about the morning of October the 3rd, 1871. He thought about the name of the document in the case, not what it said. He knew what it said. He had written it. What he thought about was the version of himself that had written it, younger, with fewer things behind him, in a field at dawn with a pen in his hand, and the understanding that speaking up would cost him everything he had spent 12 years building, and the understanding that not speaking would cost someone else something he could not calculate from where he was standing. He had made a choice. He had been paying for it in the only currency that actually costs something. In the small, dark hours of every night since, in the weight of a name, he said, in empty rooms, in the particular ache of a thing you can't put down because you never gave it a proper surface to rest on. Some debts can't be paid in the year they were made, but that doesn't mean they stop being owed. Down the hall, Nahla lay on her cot with the coat folded over the end of the bed. She could hear him through the wall. Not words, just the creak of the mattress, the soft, heavy sound of a man sitting in a room thinking about something that weighs too much to set aside. She had been listening to it for 3 nights now. She had learned to read the quality of the silence by what came before it. Tonight's silence was different. He had said her father's name at supper and gone pale in the way men go pale when they hear a thing they already knew but were not prepared to hear out loud. She had watched it happen across the table. She had filed it away. She turned on her side. Outside the window, the night was deep and warm. Somewhere south, a whippoorwill called 3 times and went quiet. The sound carried in the dry air the way sounds carry when there's nothing to absorb them, whole and clear and briefly perfect. She thought about the map, rolled tight, wrapped in oilcloth, no larger than her thumb, tucked into the cavity in the left sole of the boot on the floor beside the bed. Her father had sewn the oilcloth himself. He had done it carefully the way he did everything, the land map first, folded to the precise dimensions, and then the oilcloth wrapped twice, and then the rawhide binding, and then the final sewing of the sole back over it. His hands had been steady while he worked. She had watched them. She was 15 years old, and she had watched his hands and thought, why is he being so careful with a piece of paper? She understood now. He had known that a piece of paper in the right hands, in the right room, with the right witness, could undo what men with guns could not. She had not yet found the right room. She was beginning to think she might have found the right witness. The man through the wall was sitting in the dark, holding something in a leather case, and she did not know what it was. But she had watched him for 4 days now. The bad knee he didn't complain about, the coffee poured for 2 without thinking, the way he had stood in the hallway of the county building and gone still when he saw the name on the survey map. And she was starting to understand the shape of what he was carrying. It was the same shape as what she carried. Differently weighted, differently angled, but the same essential form, a thing done that could not be undone, and a debt that had never been given a surface to rest on. She was not forgiving him. She was watching to see whether he knew the difference between remorse and repair. One was free, the other cost something. Outside, the whippoorwill called once more and fell silent. The river moved in the dark somewhere beyond the rooftops, moving the same direction it always moved, indifferent to everything on its banks, carrying everything downstream that the land gave it. Nahla closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a long time, and in the room next door, Elias Cord reached under the cot one more time, took out the leather case, and opened it again. He removed the folded paper. He held it in both hands in the dark. He did not open it, but this time his thumb traced the edge of the fold. Slowly, the way you read something with your hands when you're not yet ready to look at it with your eyes. Tomorrow, they had to go back to the county building. The 3rd visit. More forms, more maps on the wall. He would have to stand in that hallway again. He would have to stand next to a woman whose father's name was on a survey map she had seen for a fraction of a second before she looked away, and he would have to decide whether to keep pretending he didn't know why it mattered to her, or whether it was time, finally, to stop pretending. He folded the paper. He put it back. He closed the case. He lay back on the cot. His knee ached. The paper in the case was a copy. He had made it himself in October of 1871, the night before he signed the official report. The night when there was still time to do something other than what he did. He had made it because some part of him, the part that had not yet learned to live with the weight, had needed to keep something. A record of what he knew, a private reckoning. He had carried it for 6 years. He had never shown it to anyone. What he did not know, could not know, lying there in the dark with a case under his cot and the woman's breathing audible through the thin wall between them, was that Nahla Serrano had something in the sole of her boot that would make the paper in his case either the most useful thing he owned or the most damning. He would find out which, but not yet. For now, the night pressed in around the boarding house, and Del Rio kept its quiet. And 2 people lay awake on opposite sides of a wall with the same debt between them, and neither of them knew yet that the other was holding half of what it would take to pay it. She found it on the 5th morning, not looking for it, not yet. She had woken early before the light came fully into the room and gone downstairs to fill the pitcher from the water basin in the hallway, and on the way back, passing his door, she had seen it standing open. He was not inside. He had gone out at dawn, the way he sometimes did, the bad knee taking him down the stairs slowly in the quiet before the boarding house woke. She had heard it. She had not moved. but the door was open. She stopped in the hallway. She looked at the door for a long moment, then she went inside. She was not proud of it. She would not have called it trespassing exactly. They were legally married, legally cohabiting, and she had never believed that the forms people used to own things actually determined the truth of ownership. But she would not have called it right either. She went inside because there was a thing she needed to know, and the door was open, and the man who knew it was not there. The room was spare. A cot, a washstand, a chair with a jacket over the back of it. The traveling case she had heard him moving at night, sitting now on the floor under the cot with the broken latch visible. She looked at it for a long moment. She looked at the small chest of drawers beside the washstand. The top drawer was not fully closed. She told herself later that she had only meant to look at the outside of it, to see whether it was what she thought it was. But she had known before she touched it. She had known the way you know when you are 21 years old and you have been carrying a debt since you were 15, that the thing you are about to find will change the shape of everything. She opened the drawer. Inside, a folded bandana, a spare collar button, a small tin of boot grease, a stub of candle worn down to an inch, and beneath the bandana, pressed flat against the bottom of the drawer, a piece of paper, folded once lengthwise, once across. The fold lines were so worn they had gone soft, almost transparent. This was paper that had been opened and closed many times, paper that had been handled with the particular regularity of a private ritual. She knew the smell before she touched it. Old ink, the specific dryness of a document made to record and kept to testify. She picked it up. She unfolded it. It took her less than 10 seconds to understand what she was looking at. It was a map, hand-drawn. The lines were careful, even practiced. Someone who knew surveying, who understood the grammar of measurement. Eastern Val Verde County, the arroyo marked in the older notation, the parcel lines drawn in the careful grid of a man who had learned to be precise. The boundaries of the property were rendered in darker ink than the surrounding land. At the upper right corner, a date, October 1871. In the lower left margin, a notation in the same hand that had drawn the map, Serrano land, eastern parcel, approx. 340 acres, original grant holders, Fa, Serrano and family, removed under ranger escort, Oct. 3, 1871. See official report. This copy made for private record. She did not move for a very long time. The candle stub on the dresser, the collar button, the boot grease, the ordinary wreckage of a man's days arranged around a piece of paper he had carried for 6 years inside a drawer he hadn't locked. She folded it again. She set it back. She pressed the bandana flat over it, exactly as she had found it. She pushed the drawer closed to its original gap. She went back to her room. She sat on the edge of the cot. She thought about her father's hands sewing the sole of the boot in the lamplight. She thought about the name of the arroyo, Arroyo Serrano, the older notation. She thought about her brother Tomas, who had been 23 years old and who had stood in the doorway of the barn with both hands up, showing them empty, asking to be heard, and who had not been given the chance to be heard. She thought about a ranger's signature at the bottom of an official report. She thought about a man who poured 2 cups of coffee without thinking about it, who had gone pale when she said her father's name, who held paper in the dark at night the way people hold things they cannot put down and cannot carry. She sat with this for the length of time It took the morning light to move from the door to the foot of the cot. Then she heard his step on the stairs. He came through the front door at the bottom with the particular heaviness of a man whose knee has been punished by the morning cold. She heard him in the hallway, the pause, the sound of him hanging his hat on the peg. She heard him start up the stairs. She opened her door before he reached the top. He stopped on the landing. They looked at each other. His face was the face of a man who has been outside long enough to think through something difficult and who has not yet arrived at the other side of it. Open in the way that comes after resolution. Not the openness of peace, but of someone who has decided to stop carrying something in one hand and move it to the other. Nahla was still holding the pitcher. She said, "October 3rd, 1871. He didn't move. "You were with the Rangers who came to the eastern parcel." She kept her voice the same way she kept her hands, deliberate, still. "You were there when they took our land." He stood on the landing. He did not ask how she knew. He said, "Yes." One word, the same weight as everything behind it. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face moved. Not grief, not rage, not the particular expression of a woman who has just received a shock. Something older than any of those. The expression of a person who has been searching for a face for 6 years and has now found it standing 6 feet away from her in a boarding house hallway in a town that had always known what it was. "You didn't fire," she said. "I know. There were accounts." A pause. "My father took accounts." "No," he said. "But you signed the report." He said nothing. "You were there when my brother stood in that doorway. You saw it. You could have spoken." "Yes," he said. She held the pitcher. The hallway smelled of wood polish and the dried herbs Mrs. Morales hung from the ceiling joists. Lavender, something sharper she couldn't name. Downstairs, a pan scraped across the stove. The ordinary sounds of a morning in a house where people lived ordinary lives, right below a conversation that was the end of one story and the beginning of another. "I found the copy," she said, "in your drawer." "I know. You knew I would." He looked at her. For the first time since she had known him, he looked like what he was. An old man with bad knees and a weight he had been carrying since before she was old enough to understand what weights were, not apologetic. Apology was too small a word, too easy to say, too easy to accept and move past. Just visible, finally, entirely, without the distance that had stood between them since the 7-minute ceremony. "I didn't lock it," he said. She stood very still. "That's not the same as leaving it open," she said. "No," he said, "it isn't." The silence settled between them. Not the silence of the first 3 days, which had been a held breath, a negotiation of positions. This was different. This was the silence after a door has been broken down. You can't rebuild the door. You can only decide what to do with the open space. Nahla set the pitcher down on the window ledge beside her. She did it slowly with both hands, the way you set something down when you need your hands free for what comes next. She looked at him the way her father had looked at the land when he was drawing the map, measuring. "Tomas was the one who stood in the doorway," she said. "He was 23. He had a wife. She was 4 months along." Elias said nothing. His hands hung at his sides. "He put his hands up," she said. "He showed them empty. He did everything a man is supposed to do. Her voice did not waver. It had the quality of stone that has been polished very smooth. You can't find a grip on it. And the men with guns decided that what he showed them didn't matter. "I know," Elias said. "Do you know what happened after?" "I know he died," he said. "He was shot twice," she said. "Once in the shoulder. He didn't go down. They shot him again. I was in the barn. I was 15 years old, and I was watching through a gap in the slats." She paused. "My father saw it too. He was holding the map. He was still holding it when they took him to the road." In the hallway of a government building 3 days ago, she had looked at a survey map and looked away in a fraction of a second and resumed walking and said nothing. He had seen it and said nothing. They had both been carrying this for 3 days, and before that for 6 years, and before that for the years before the morning of October the 3rd, when none of it had happened yet. Elias Cord stood on the landing and did not move. He had spent 20 years learning not to look afraid. He did not look afraid now. He looked like a man standing in the only place there is to stand when the thing you've been circling for years finally holds still long enough for you to see it clearly. "I didn't fire," he said. "I heard you the first time," she said. She picked up the picture again. She held it against her chest. "What I need to know," she said. And here something shifted in her voice, not softening, but angling, the way a blade angles when you change the point you mean to make. "Is what you're going to do about it now." He looked at her. She looked at him. This was not the Nahla Serrano who had stood in a 7-minute ceremony with her punhol cerrados and her eyes on the floor. This was not the woman who had poured her own coffee and answered his formal English with better English than he owned. This was not even the woman who had watched him go pale at her father's name across a supper table and filed it away. This was a woman who had been waiting 6 years for this precise conversation, and now that she was in it, she was the only one in the hallway who knew where it was going. He was still figuring out that she had been 3 steps ahead of him since the day they met. "I don't know yet," he said. She held his gaze for a long moment. "I know," she said. She turned and went into her room. She pulled the door almost closed. Not all the way, not the way you close a door on a conversation that is over, but the way you leave it when you know the conversation has only just found its real starting point. He stood on the landing. His knee ached. Downstairs, Mrs. Morales called up that coffee was ready. Neither of them moved. The copy of the map was in his drawer, and the original was in the sole of her boot. And the distance between those 2 pieces of paper, the distance between a private reckoning and a legal instrument, between remorse and repair, was exactly the length of whatever came next. He had made a choice in a field at dawn when he was 46 years old, and the cost of honor seemed too high. He was 52 now. The cost had only gone up. The door stood slightly open between them. He didn't know whether that was an invitation or a judgment. He wasn't sure she had decided yet either. She came downstairs first. He was still on the landing when she passed him on the stairs. Not brushing, not close, just the particular proximity of 2 people sharing a space that isn't built for avoidance. She didn't look at him. He didn't speak. Mrs. Morales had set coffee and cornbread on the table by the window the way she did every morning, as if the world's arrangements were none of her business. Nahla sat down. She poured her cup. She looked out at the street. He came down a minute later. The stairs announced him. He sat across from her, the seat he had taken that first morning out of habit or courtesy, or the kind of small human gravity that forms even between strangers sharing a table. He poured his own cup. They drank in silence for a long time. Outside, Del Rio was beginning its morning. A wagon rolled past on the main road. A dog barked once and was answered. The sky above the far ridge was the pale, indifferent blue of a hot summer morning in Texas, the kind of sky that offers nothing and promises nothing and will be exactly the same color tomorrow, whether the things happening beneath it get resolved or not. Nahla set down her cup. She reached into her coat. She set something on the table between them. It was a piece of paper, not the folded, worn copy she had found in his drawer. This one was thicker, older. The paper itself had gone the color of weak tea, and the edges were uneven, cut or torn by hand. She had unfolded it carefully, the way you unfold something you have refolded hundreds of times, something whose creases you know the way you know a scar, by feel, in the dark. She smoothed it flat with both palms. It was a map. Elias Cord leaned forward very slightly. He did not reach for it. He looked. It was the same eastern parcel he had copied 22 years ago. The same arroyo, the same grid of measurements, the same property lines rendered in darker ink than the surrounding land. But where his copy had been the work of a man trained in the grammar of precision, clinical and exact, this was different. This map had been drawn by a man who loved what he was drawing. The lines were as precise, more precise in fact, the measurements careful to a degree that spoke of weeks of work, not hours, but the margins held something his copy had not. In the lower left margin, where his copy noted original grant holders V. Serrano and family, this one said something else. Something in Spanish, something in handwriting that had the quality of a man writing to be understood by his children, not by a government. Estas tierras son de los que vendrán después de nosotros, que las reciban en nombre de todo lo que fue. These lands belong to those who will come after us. Let them receive them in the name of everything that was. Below that, 3 signatures, white men's names, in 3 different hands, dated 1865, 6 years before the Rangers came. Elias stared at the map for a long time. "Where?" he said. He stopped. He tried again. "How long have you been carrying that?" "Since the morning they came," she said. "My father sewed it into the sole of my boot the night before. He knew." She picked up her coffee cup. "He always knew things early. It was not a gift he enjoyed." The boot was beside her chair, the left one worn at the heel, the sole neat but visibly thickened. He looked at it. He looked back at the map. "He drew this himself," he said. "Every line," she said, "over the course of 1 week in September. He did it after supper at the kitchen table with a lamp. He would measure during the day and draw at night. I used to watch him." She paused. "He sang while he worked. Old songs. I don't remember all the words anymore." She said it the way people sometimes tell small, true things to fill the space where large, true things are too heavy to carry all at once. Elias said nothing. His hands sat on the table, motionless, the hands of a man who has spent 30 years learning not to fidget when he was uncomfortable, and who is now profoundly uncomfortable. "There were 3 witnesses," she said. "Family friends of my father's, men from Brackettville and Eagle Pass. 2 of them are dead. The third, she looked at the names in the margin. I don't know about the third. What did the official grant say? That the land was acquired by purchase in 1869 by a man named Krieger, who paid $40. She let the number sit there. My father had held that parcel since 1858. He built the main house by hand. He dug the well himself. He planted the windbreak trees that are still standing. $40. Elias thought about what it cost to buy a man's life's work. He thought about what it cost to sign a report certifying the legality of that purchase. He thought about the particular mathematics of a man who had understood the transaction in full and signed anyway, and had been doing the arithmetic of that decision ever since. 3 witnesses from 1865, he said slowly, and a map made in the week before they came. He had heard rumors, she said, men talking. He was careful. He drew the map and made 2 copies. One he hid in the house, one he gave to a neighbor. The one in the house was found during the removal. The one with the neighbor disappeared. I don't know what happened to it. She looked at the document on the table. This is the one he sewed into my boot. You were 15. He told me not to take the boot off until I was somewhere safe. A pause. I didn't take it off for 11 days. Elias Cord sat with this. The coffee had gone lukewarm. Mrs. Morales was moving around in the kitchen, the sound of her working a kind of domestic counterpoint to the silence at the table. Pots, water, the rhythmic sound of bread being shaped, the ordinary life of a house occurring around the edges of something that was not ordinary at all. Tell me about your father, he said. It was the first time he had asked for something that wasn't logistical. Nahla looked at him. Something in her face shifted. Not the measuring look from the hallway, not the careful stillness she had worn since the 7-minute ceremony. Something that had not been there before. The way a face changes when the person wearing it understands they are being asked a real question. He was a surveyor, she said, before the territory changed. He had a Spanish land grant from his father's side, and he knew the law, more than most people gave him credit for. He kept papers, he kept records. He understood that the only protection a man in his position had was documentation, and he documented everything. She turned the cup in her hands. He was also funny. People don't expect that. He told terrible jokes at supper. My brother used to say he had the worst sense of humor in Val Verde County and the best sense of where water ran underground. A beat. He was right about both. The way she said Tomas, without saying the name, only the shape of him, was a kind of testimony all its own. After they took the land, she said, he went to New Mexico Territory. A cousin in Las Cruces. He had some work, surveying mostly, the kind of odd jobs a man takes when he has no home to return to. He wrote letters. She stopped. He wrote letters. I wrote back. Neither of us said the things we meant. Where is he now? Still there, Las Cruces. She looked at the window. He is 61 years old. He has a bad hip. He gets up before dawn because he cannot sleep past it, and he drinks his coffee standing at the door looking east. She said this the way someone describes a thing they know in the body, not just the mind. Something told many times, turned into a permanent image. I know this because he told me in a letter. He said, I have been looking east every morning for 6 years, as if the land will show up on the horizon if I look long enough. I know it won't. I look anyway. The kitchen sounds had stopped. The house had gone quiet in the way that houses sometimes do, as if the building itself has noticed what is happening inside it. Elias Cord looked at the map, the signatures in the margin, the handwriting that had set down estas tierras son de los que vendrán después de nosotros, with the steady hand of a man who understood exactly what he was writing and why. "What would it take," he said slowly, "to register this?" She looked at him. "In the courts, formally." He kept his voice level, the voice of a man presenting a legal question, nothing more. A map with 3 witness signatures from 1865, the original. What would it take? She looked at him for a long moment. "A witness who was present in 1871, she said. "Someone who could testify to the legitimacy of the original claim and the circumstances of the removal. Without corroboration from someone who was actually there, the court would treat it as a contested document." She set the cup down. One witness, with standing, with a name that would be believed. The word believed sat between them. It carried everything. A Texas Ranger's name was believed. A Texas Ranger's testimony in a civil proceeding was not just admitted, it was weighted. The system that had made it easy to take what belonged to Vicente Serrano had also built something that now, in this moment, was the one mechanism that could begin to unravel what had been taken. The same name on the same report could be signed at the bottom of a different document. The same man who had once chosen silence could choose something else. Some debts can't be paid in the year they were made, but that doesn't mean they stop being owed. Elias Cord did not say anything for a long time. The map lay between them on the table. The copy was in his drawer upstairs. The original was here, in the light. 2 records of the same truth, one made in remorse, one made in hope. Both of them waiting for the same next step. "If I testified," he said, "and if the deed were registered in your name, your father could come back." Yes. He could come home to land that was legally his. Yes. He turned his coffee cup. He put it down. "And if something were to—" He stopped. He started again with a different word. "What is the value of the parcel now, after the improvements made by—" "Krieger sold it in 1874, she said. "The new owner made additions, the well house, a second barn." She said it plainly, without heat. It would take money to buy it back, more money than I have. She said this without self-pity, just the flat measurement of a fact. The way her father must have looked at problems that needed solving, clearly, without flinching, with the surveyor's habit of seeing the thing as it actually was before deciding what to do about it. "But with a registered title," he said, "with a registered title, there would be grounds to challenge the 1869 transfer in a federal court with the right presentation." She looked at him steadily. "It would not be simple, it would not be fast, but it would be possible in a way that it is currently not." He looked at her. She looked at him. They had been in this boarding house for 5 days. They had eaten together 12 times and passed each other in the hallway perhaps twice that many. They had gone to the land office and the courthouse and the surveyor's office together, and she had watched him look at the walls, and he had watched her hands, and neither of them had said the name that was hanging in the air between them like smoke. They had arrived at this table carrying opposite ends of the same truth, and they were still carrying it, but now they were carrying it facing each other, which is a different thing entirely. He thought about the copy in his drawer, the careful map he had made in 1871 before he signed the report, before he told himself that one man's refusal would not change what was already moving. He had made the copy the way a man plants a marker at the site of something he knows he will need to return to. He had never told anyone he had it. He had never used it. He had carried it for 6 years the way Vicente Serrano looked east every morning, as if it would show up on the horizon if he held it long enough. It had. It had come back in the form of a 21-year-old woman with a map sewn into the sole of her boot, sitting across from him at a boarding house table in a July morning, waiting to see what he would do with what he had always known. "The signatures," he said, "the 3 men from 1865. I would need to verify them independently." "I know. And the surveying notation, if the measurements match what's in the county ledger." "They will," she said. "He was precise. There's a man named Odell Garrett who does the county surveying now. I know him. He owes me a legitimate favor, not the kind I'd usually call in." He looked at the map. He could review this and give an opinion on the methodology. Independent opinion. That's what a court would need. She was very still. "You're talking about testimony," she said. "Not a question. Not yet." "I'm talking about what it would take," he said carefully. "Those are not different things." He looked at her. "No," he said, "they're not." The morning had fully arrived now. The light through the window had shifted from the pale blue of early hours to the stronger gold of 9 o'clock, the kind of light that makes everything more visible. The dust on the sill, the wear in the tablecloth, the faces of 2 people sitting across from each other with a map between them that meant something different to each of them, and the same thing to both. He was thinking about his pension. He had not said the word yet. She had not asked about it. But it was in the room the same way the map had been in the room before she unfolded it. Present, waiting to be named. She reached out and folded the map slowly, the way she had unfolded it, with the particular care of someone handling an object that has no replacement. She folded it in the same creases it had always known, the ones her father had made and she had followed all these years. She held it for a moment. Then she picked up the left boot from beside her chair. She began working the sole loose with her thumbnail. It came up at one edge, then more. There was a seam in the stitching that she had clearly opened and resealed many times. She slid the map in. She pressed the sole back. She put the boot back down. He watched all of this without moving. "I want you to understand something," she said, looking at the boot and not at him. "My father did not send me to find a witness. He did not send me anywhere. I came to Del Rio because this was where the land records were and because I had heard there was a federal land agent here who sometimes could be persuaded." She looked up. "I didn't know you were going to be here. I didn't know who you were when they told me your name." "I know. I'm not using you," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not. This isn't a plan I came in with." A pause. "You happened. This happened. And I'm trying to figure out what it means now that it has." He nodded slowly. "So am I," he said. Outside, the wagon had come back down the street. The dog was quiet. The sky had gone fully blue. The pale hesitation of early morning burned off entirely. It was going to be another hot day. He looked at the map in the boot and then at the woman who had been wearing it. For 6 years, he had thought about what he owed. He had thought about it in abstract, the architecture of guilt, the shapes it took when you were alone at night with a document you hadn't locked away. He had not thought about it as something that might have a face, something that might sit across from him and pour its own coffee and answer his questions with better English than he owned, and fold a map back into a boot sole with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 100 times. He had not thought about it as someone who was also trying to figure out what came next. "I need to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. "Do you trust me?" It was not a request. It was not quite a question in the ordinary sense. Not the kind of thing you asked and waited for an answer to. It was more like the thing a man says when he is trying to locate himself, trying to understand what kind of ground he is standing on before he takes a step. She was quiet for a long moment. "No," she said. He nodded. It was a fair answer, and he had expected it. "But," she said, "I think you're trying to be worth trusting." She said it the way she said most things, plainly, without softening, as a measurement. "That's different," she said. "That matters." He looked at her. For the first time since the 7-minute ceremony, he did not feel like a man being observed. He felt like a man being seen. There is a difference, and it is the whole distance between guilt and responsibility. One is something you carry, and one is something you act on. He pushed back his chair. He stood up. "I'll talk to Odell Garrett this afternoon," he said, "about the surveying notation. I won't mention names." She nodded. He started for the stairs. He got 3 steps, and then he stopped. He turned back. "The third signature," he said, "in the margin, the one you don't know about." She looked at him carefully. "The name is Barwell," he said. "J.R. Barwell. He's retired. He lives in Uvalde. He's 70 years old, and he still goes to the Methodist church every Sunday morning." He looked at her. "He is not a man who lies in church or out of it. He never was." Nahla Serrano did not move for a full 5 seconds. Then she said, very quietly, "How do you know that name?" "Because I knew his son," he said, "before." He said before the way people say it when they mean a time that has a clean edge, a time before the thing that changed the whole shape of what came after. He did not say anything else. He turned and went up the stairs. She sat at the table. She looked at the boot. She thought about what it meant that the man who had signed the report in 1871 also knew the name of the witness who could help undo it. She thought about the years in which those two facts had existed simultaneously and separately, unknown to each other, waiting. She thought about her father drawing the map by lamplight. She thought about Tomas, his hands empty and raised. She thought about a man who had carried a copy of the wrong he'd done for 6 years and who, for all of that time, had also been carrying, without knowing it, one of the threads that could pull it undone. She thought, the world makes strange instruments of repair. She was not ready to forgive him. Forgiveness was not the point, or not yet the point. It was too large a word for where they were, too final for something still in motion. What she felt was smaller than forgiveness and more complicated. It was the tentative recognition that the man upstairs was not only the man who had signed the report. He was also the man who had not locked the drawer, who had gone pale at her father's name, who had made the copy in the first place, as if some part of him had always known that truth had a way of demanding its own record. He was both of those things. She was not yet sure what to do with that, but she was beginning to think it might matter. She picked up the boot. She held it for a moment. The weight of it, the worn heel, the map sewn into the sole the way her father had sewn her name into everything he'd made, so that whatever happened, something of his work would remain. She put it back on. She laced it. She stood up. There was a knock at the front door of the boarding house. She heard Mrs. Morales crossing the hall below. She heard the door open. She heard a voice, low, formal, carrying the particular timbre of a man who was accustomed to his words having weight. She heard Mrs. Morales say, "He's upstairs. The voice said, "It's not him I've come to see." She heard the name, Marshal Holt Desmond. She was still standing. Upstairs, she heard Elias Cord's step go still on the boards above her. He had heard it too. The morning light was very bright in the window. Outside, Del Rio was going about its business. Inside, something had just walked through the front door that was going to make the next few days considerably more difficult, and both of them knew it. And they had perhaps 30 seconds before it reached the top of the stairs. She stood at the table with the map in her boot and the morning coffee cold in her cup, and she thought about the distance between a private reckoning and what happened when the world decided to interrupt it. 30 seconds. She reached up and straightened the collar of her dress. She was ready before he reached the landing. Marshal Holt Desmond did not remove his hat. This was the first thing Nahla noticed. He had come into Mrs. Morales' parlor, a room of low ceilings and lace curtains, a room that had nothing to do with him, and he had not taken off his hat. It was a small discourtesy, deliberate in the way that only small discourtesies can be. It cost him nothing. It cost her the thing it was meant to cost. He was not a large man. He had the kind of build that looks unremarkable until you notice the way he stood, the feet placed, the weight distributed, the economy of gesture that belongs to men who have learned that authority sits in stillness, not size. He was somewhere past 50. His eyes were the flat, practical gray of gunmetal. He looked at her for a moment, then he looked at the table, the coffee cups, the tablecloth, the nothing that remained visible of the morning's real conversation. "Mrs. Cord," he said. The name landed the way he intended it to. She said nothing. Elias came down the stairs. He crossed the room without hurrying and stood at the edge of the parlor between the door and the marshal, not quite blocking either exit. Mrs. Morales had retreated to the kitchen. Through the thin wall they could hear her being very quiet. "Desmond," Elias said. "Cord." The marshal turned to include him in the room. "Good timing. I was hoping to speak with you both." "Then speak," Elias said. Desmond looked at him for a moment. Then he smiled, not with warmth, with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had practiced the expression until it no longer required feeling. "I heard you've been spending time at the land office," he said, "and at the county surveyor's, asking questions about the Krieger parcel." Elias said nothing. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Desmond said. "I'm here because I think there's been some confusion about the scope of the current arrangement." He gestured lightly between the two of them. The marriage was registered to establish residential standing, nothing more. It wasn't intended as a platform for litigation. "Who said anything about litigation?" Elias said. "No one," Desmond said. "Yet." He let the word sit. I want to make sure no one needs to." He turned back to Nahla. "The land dispute you're contemplating, and I know about the map, Mrs. Cord, because I make it my business to know, is not something the federal government will look on with patience. The parcel in question was legally transferred in 1869. The records are clear. Challenging that transfer would require testimony from parties with standing, and I want to be candid with you. Any such proceeding would be reviewed very carefully for the irregularities that tend to appear when personal interest shapes official memory." He said official memory the way people say things they don't want to have to explain further. It was a threat built small enough to fit inside a sentence that couldn't be quoted in a court. "I want to be equally candid with you, Cord," he said, turning. "Your testimony, if given, would be submitted as that of a retired ranger drawing a federal pension. That pension is reviewed annually. It is not automatic. It requires a certification from the district marshal's office." He paused. "My office?" The room went very quiet. Outside, Del Rio was still going about its business, a cart horse's hooves on the packed earth of the main road, a shout from somewhere up toward the saloon, the ordinary machinery of a town that had nothing to do with what was happening in this parlor and would have nothing to say about it afterward. "The marriage can also be reviewed," Desmond added. "If there were procedural irregularities at the time of registration, and I am not saying there were, it could be dissolved. The terms of the dissolution would be decided by the marshal's office." He looked at Nahla. "You would be remanded to the reservation at Mescalero under the standard resettlement protocol, New Mexico territory. That process takes approximately 10 days. He said it conversationally, like a man describing weather. "That covers everything, I think," he said. "I hope it clarifies things." He turned to go. He stopped. He looked back once at both of them. "I find that clarity prevents a great deal of unnecessary difficulty for everyone." He left. The door closed behind him with the particular precision of a man who made sure doors did what he wanted them to do. The parlor was very still. Nahla stood with her hands loose at her sides. She was looking at the door. Her face was the face she had worn at the 7-minute ceremony, not blank, but sealed. The face of someone who has prepared for the weather they are now standing in. Elias Cord sat down. He sat in the same chair he had sat in every morning for 5 days, the one across from hers by the window. And he put his elbows on his knees, and he looked at the floor, and he did not say anything. The threat was clean. He had to give Desmond that. It was clean, and it was airtight, and it had been delivered in a room with no witnesses and no paper trail. Testify, and the pension went. The pension was $42 a month, which was the difference between a room in a boarding house and sleeping on the ground. It was every meal he would eat after the work in his body gave out, which it was going to do. The left knee was already had been telling him since the winter before last. He was 52 years old. He had no savings. He had spent 30 years serving a government that would, at the first inconvenience, stop serving him back. And the marriage. If the marriage was dissolved, he looked at Nahla. She was still looking at the door. She had not moved. He thought she knew this was possible. She had always known this was possible. She had walked into the 7-minute ceremony knowing the man conducting it could end it whenever the ending suited him. She had eaten 12 breakfasts in this boarding house and visited the land office and the county surveyor, and sat across from him this morning with her father's map on the table, and she had known the whole time that Desmond could appear at any moment and put 10 days between her and everything she had come here to do. She had known it. She had come anyway. He thought about the pension. He thought about $42 a month and what it represented and what else it might represent and whether the two things were actually the same. He thought about a man named Vicente Serrano, who got up before dawn every morning in Las Cruces and stood at his door looking east. He thought about the report he had signed in 1871 and about the particular arithmetic of a man who understands a transaction fully, in real time, and signs it anyway. He thought, I have spent 6 years paying for that choice. He thought, but I have spent 6 years choosing what kind of payment to make. He went up to his room. He sat on the edge of his bed. The window faced west, the wrong direction, the far ridge brown and flat in the July heat, offering nothing. He sat there until the light went orange, and then until it went gray, and then until Mrs. Morales called for supper, and he said he wasn't hungry, and she said all right, the way she said most things. He did not sleep. He lay on his back in the dark and listened to the house settle. Del Rio went quiet around him the way it always did. The saloon last, the horses earlier, the dogs quiet by midnight. The moon came up and put a bar of light across the floor, and he watched it move, the slow rotation of a night that would not hurry. He thought about the pension. He thought about it honestly, which is the way you have to think about the things you are afraid of. Look straight at them, count their teeth, understand exactly how much they can take. $42 a month. Without it, he had the clothes he was wearing and a horse that was 10 years old and a handgun he would not be able to maintain. He had the kind of health that a man his age has when he has spent 30 years doing what he'd done. The knee, the hearing in the left ear, the ribs that still ached when the cold came in. He had, in other words, exactly what a man has when he is approaching the end of something and does not have a soft landing prepared. He thought about this for a long time. He did not resolve it that night. He lay in the dark with the arithmetic of it and the weight of it and the specific fatigue of a man who has been carrying something for 6 years and has finally arrived at the moment he has been carrying it toward, and has discovered that the moment is harder than the carrying was. He slept somewhere near dawn, a thin, unsatisfying sleep. He woke to the sound of movement downstairs. He sat up. The light outside was the earliest kind, not the blue of pre-dawn, but the beginning of actual morning. The bar of moonlight was gone. He heard below him the floorboards. He heard a drawer open. He heard the specific sound of a bag being packed, the soft industry of it, the careful, methodical quiet of a person doing something private that they do not want to be heard doing. He got up. He crossed to the door and opened it. He stood at the top of the stairs. Below, in the parlor, Nahla stood with her back to him. She was folding something into a traveling bag, the small flat bag she had arrived with. She worked without hurrying. She folded with the same precision she brought to everything, the economy of motion of a person who had learned not to waste time or effort or space. She had not woken him. She had not knocked on his door. She was not asking. He understood this the way you understand a thing that doesn't need to be spoken. She was not asking him to risk the pension. She was not asking him to testify. She had not asked him for anything, not once, in the 5 days they had shared this table. Not asked, not implied, not leveraged. She had told him the truth, and she had shown him the map. And she had said, "You happened, this happened." And she had offered him the hardest kind of courtesy there is, the courtesy of not making yourself a burden to someone else's conscience. She was packing the bag so that if he chose the pension, if he chose the $42 a month and the quiet and the practical warmth of a decision made in his own interest, she would not be there to see it. She was removing herself from the equation so that whatever he decided, he would decide it freely, without her eyes on it, without having to look at her face when he made the choice. He stood at the top of the stairs and looked at the woman packing her bag in the gray early light of a July morning in Del Rio, Texas. And he thought, she has given him every reason to let her go. He thought, and she is the only person in 6 years who has. He watched her fold one more item into the bag. She did not look up. She did not know he was there, or if she knew, she had chosen in her exact and deliberate way to give him the privacy of his decision. He thought about Vicente Serrano drawing a map by lamplight, line by line, over the course of 1 week. In September, when the evenings came early, singing songs he knew his daughter would stop being able to remember. He thought, there are things that cost everything. That is not an argument against them. He turned. He went back into his room. He sat down at the small writing table by the window. He pulled out the 2 sheets of paper he kept in his coat, the ones he had not yet used, the ones that had been waiting, in the way that things wait when you are not yet ready for them. He reached for the pen. His hand was steady. Outside, the first real light of morning was coming over the far ridge. The sky was going from gray to the pale, tentative gold of early day, the light that comes before the heat, before the town wakes, before the day makes its demands known. He looked at the paper. He thought about one thing, and then he wrote. And in the parlor below, Nahla Serrano stopped folding. She stood very still, her hands on the bag, listening. She had heard the sound of a chair being pulled back. She had heard the particular silence of a man sitting down to do something deliberate. She stood there for a long moment, her hand still, her face turned toward the ceiling. She did not know what was being written above her. She did not know what he had decided, but she knew the sound of a decision being made. She looked down at the bag. She looked at the packed contents. The small, careful order she had made of her things, the preparations she had made for a departure she had not yet taken. She stood there for a long time. Then, very slowly, she began to unpack. The morning that Elias Cord walked into the Val Verde County Recorder's office, it happened to be a market day. This was not planned. Del Rio held its weekly market on the first Tuesday of August, and the first Tuesday of August was the day Elias woke before dawn, dressed in the dark without lighting the lamp, and walked out of the boarding house without eating. Nahla heard him go. She heard the door and the silence after it, and she sat at the edge of her bed in the gray early light and did not move for a long time. She did not know what he had written on those 2 sheets of paper. He had not shown her. He had come downstairs the morning after the marshal's visit with the papers folded inside his coat, and he had sat across from her at breakfast, and he had said, "Come to the recorder's office Tuesday morning. Bring the map." She had looked at him. He had said nothing else. He reached for the coffee cup, and his hand was steady, and that was the end of the conversation. She brought the map. It was folded the same way it had always been folded, the way her father had folded it, the creases worn thin at the corners from being opened and reopened in the years after he lost the land, from being checked against memory the way a man checks his pockets for something he knows is gone but cannot stop looking for. She kept it between her skin and the inside of her boot. She had kept it there for 6 years. She had walked 100 miles on top of that map without ever losing it. She unfolded it in the street outside the recorder's office in the full morning sun, smoothing it flat against her palm. It was still legible. Every line, every name. Vicente Serrano, his mark, and the signatures of 3 white men who no longer lived in Del Rio, but who had been alive and present and willing to put their names to the truth of what they had witnessed in September of 1865. She folded it back along its creases. She went inside. The recorder's office was a low-ceilinged room that smelled of paper and lamp oil, and the particular staleness of documents that have been read less than they should have been. Mr. Cabot sat behind the main counter, a precise, careful man of 60 who had recorded births and deaths and land transfers in Val Verde County for the better part of 2 decades, and had learned over those 2 decades to keep his face very still. There were 6 people in the room when Elias walked in. By the time he reached the counter, there were 12. Word moved through a small town at the speed of nothing else. Elias placed the first document on the counter. Mr. Cabot looked at it. He adjusted his spectacles. He read it once. He read it a second time, more slowly. It was a sworn deposition. Notarized in Laredo the previous Friday, before a judge Elias had ridden 2 days to reach. It stated, in the plain and unadorned language of a man who had done something he was not proud of and intended to be precise about it, that on the 14th of March, 1871, a federal incursion under the authority of Marshal Desmond's office had proceeded against the Rancho Serrano in Val Verde County, that the land had been taken under a transfer document of questionable legitimacy, that the undersigned Elias Thomas Cord, Texas Ranger, badge number 114, had been present, had witnessed the resistance of one Mateo Serrano, aged 19, who had subsequently died of his injuries, and had signed the incident report without objection, thereby lending official credibility to a transfer he believed to be unjust. He was 73 words into the document before the room had gone quiet enough to hear the clock on the wall. Then Elias placed the second document on the counter. Mr. Cabot looked at this one for a longer time. It was a deed of transfer, properly executed, stamped with the seal of the Bezar County Recorder, where the Krieger parcel had been formally listed. It recorded the purchase of 160 acres, the Rancho Serrano, as originally bounded by Vicente Serrano's survey of 1865, for the sum of $412. Every dollar Elias Cord had. The land was registered in the name of Elias and Nahla Cord as married persons, which under Texas law gave both parties equal title. Beneath the deed was a second document, handwritten on the same plain paper as the deposition. It was a notice of renunciation. Elias Cord, as co-owner, formally renounced his ownership interest in the Rancho Serrano parcel. He transferred his share to his wife, Nahla Cord, born Nahla Serrano, daughter of Vicente Serrano, to whom the land had lawfully belonged since 1865. He had signed it in front of the Bexar County judge as well. Both signatures witnessed. Both stamped. Mr. Cabot read to the bottom of the renunciation. He looked up. He looked at Elias. He looked at Nahla, who was standing 3 feet behind and to the left of Elias, the way she always stood, not behind him, not beside him, but at her own angle, watching. He looked back at the documents. "Everything in order?" Elias said. Mr. Cabot cleared his throat. "Yes," he said, "everything is in order." The room did not applaud. This was not that kind of room and not that kind of town. What it did was something quieter and in some ways heavier. It went entirely, completely still. The men who had been leaning against the far wall straightened without knowing they were doing it. The 2 women near the door stopped whispering. Someone's child, who had been fidgeting near his mother's skirt, stopped fidgeting. Marshal Holt Desmond was standing near the door. He had come in some time between the first document and the second. Nahla had noticed him. Elias had not turned around. Desmond stood now with his hat in his hand. He had taken it off, she saw, which was the first time she had ever seen him do that. He stood very still. His face had the particular expression of a man calculating very quickly how many of the people in the room were going to remember this morning. All of them, Nahla thought, every single one. Desmond did not speak. He put his hat back on. He left. The door closed. The clock ticked. Mr. Cabot stamped the deed of transfer and the renunciation. He wrote the recording number on both in his careful, practiced hand. He placed them in the outgoing file, which meant they were now part of the permanent record of Val Verde County, which meant they could not be unmade in a parlor conversation with no witnesses and no paper trail. "The copies will be ready Thursday," he said. "Thank you," Elias said. He turned from the counter. Nahla was looking at him. She did not smile. She was not a woman who smiled easily, and he was not a man who would have known what to do with an easy smile. But she was looking at him directly, without the sealed expression she had worn at the 7-minute ceremony, without the careful distance she had maintained across 12 breakfasts and 3 weeks of shared meals. She was looking at him the way you look at someone when you have finished deciding something. She reached into her boot. She unfolded the map, her father's map, the original, the one with the worn creases and the 3 signatures and Vicente Serrano's careful lines. And she placed it on the counter beside the stamped deed. 2 documents, the one Elias had made and the one her father had made, sitting side by side on the wood of the county recorder's counter in a room that smelled of paper and lamp oil and the quiet that follows something that cannot be undone. She left them there for a moment, then she picked them both up and folded them together, the deed and the map, and put them inside her coat. She had never carried anything in her coat before. She had always carried the map in her boot, the way you carry something you don't trust the world with. She put the deed there now, with it, next to her heartbeat, where the things you trust live. The letter reached Las Cruces, New Mexico Territory on the 17th day of September, 1877. The man who received it was sitting in a chair outside a dry goods store on the main road, as he sat every morning when the weather allowed, because sitting in that chair meant he could see the road, and seeing the road meant he could watch who came and went, and watching Who came and went was what you did when there was nothing else left to do with yourself. He was 61 years old. He had the hands of a man who had spent 30 years working land he loved and the past 6 years working other men's land with the careful, exhausted courtesy of someone who has learned that gratitude is the only currency available to him. He had a room behind the dry goods store. He had a blanket that had been his wife's. He had a daughter somewhere in Texas who sent him letters he read until they went soft at the folds. The letter this time was different. There was something inside it. He looked at it for a long time before he opened it. Inside was a single sheet in his daughter's handwriting, and beneath it, folded the way only someone who had handled it before knew to fold it, was the copy of the deed. The Rancho Serrano, Val Verde County, Texas. The name at the top, Nahla Serrano. His name, in her name. He looked at the road for a moment. Then he looked back at the paper. He read it once. He read it again. He folded it very carefully and held it in both hands and did not move. He did not make any sound. But the boy sweeping the store entrance, who was 13 years old and had seen Vicente Serrano sit in that chair every morning for 4 years without ever changing expression, would remember for the rest of his long life the sight of an old man crying without making any noise at all. The paper held flat against his chest, the morning light falling across him and across the empty road and across the mountains to the west that he had been watching for 6 years. Elias Cord slept through the night for the first time in 6 years on the evening of the day the documents were filed. He lay in the same room, in the same boarding house, on the same thin mattress. The same bar of moonlight came across the same floor, the same night sounds. Nothing was different, except that he had put the thing down. He had been carrying it, the specific arithmetic of a moment in 1871, the weight of a report signed by a younger version of himself, who had understood exactly what he was doing and done it anyway, for so long that he had come to think of it as part of his structure, the way men come to think of old injuries, the knee that aches before rain, the rib that catches when he breathes wrong. You stop counting it as loss. You start counting it as self. And now it was not there. He did not feel lighter. That is not how it works. After years, he felt the way ground feels after something heavy has sat on it for a long time. Different, altered, still learning what shape it is now. But he slept. He slept without waking in the middle of the night, reaching for the arithmetic of what he owed. He slept the way a man sleeps when the account is settled, not rich, not saved, not mended, but even. He woke in the morning to the smell of coffee. He went downstairs. Nahla was at the table. She had the map out, the original, and she was looking at it with the focused attention of a woman planning, not remembering. She had a pencil and a small piece of paper, and she was making notes. He sat down across from her. Mrs. Morales brought the coffee without being asked. He looked at the map upside down across the table. He could make out the creek line, the survey boundary, the careful notations in Spanish in Vicente Serrano's handwriting. There's a good well on the east side, he said. She looked up. The Krieger family put in a new one in 73, but the old one's still there, spring-fed, doesn't dry out. He paused. I know because I helped run a survey line through that land in 71. A silence. The eastern fence line needs repair, he said. I can see it from the road." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the map. "I know," she said. They drank their coffee. The letter arrived at the boarding house 3 months later, in November, when the air coming off the river had begun to carry the first edge of the season's cold. Mrs. Morales set it on the table without comment, and Elias sat with it in his hands for a moment before he recognized the handwriting. He read it once. He set it down. He read it again. "There is a room at the ranch," she had written, "east side, near the well. Small window, faces the creek. It was my brother's. No one has slept in it since we left. I would like someone to sleep in it now, not as a husband. That is not what I am offering. I am offering what you gave me in the recorder's office. A piece of ground to stand on. A place where a debt stops needing to be carried, because it has been paid. Come if you want. You do not have to." He sat with the letter for a long time. Outside, Del Rio went about its business. Somewhere up toward the saloon, someone was laughing. The late afternoon light was coming low and golden through the window, the same light that had been coming through that window for months, the same light that would come tomorrow and the day after. He folded the letter. He put it in his coat, inside, where the things you trust live. Then he went upstairs to pack. Some debts can't be paid in the year they were made. He had carried that truth for 6 years, turning it over in his hands in the dark, convinced that the carrying was the punishment and the punishment was what he deserved. He had not understood, not until the morning he watched a woman fold her things back into a bag and understood that she was trying to spare him, that a debt is not a life sentence. It is a direction. It is the thing that tells you, when you are lost, which way the way forward is. He chose silence in 1871. He spent 6 years paying for it in the only currency that actually costs something: peace. Would you have done differently back then when the price was that high? I've thought about it a long time. I don't know that any of us can answer that cleanly from the safe distance of now. But I think about Nahla Serrano standing at that counter with 2 documents against her heart. And I think about the kind of grace it takes to offer a room to the man who helped take your home. Not because he deserves it, but because she understood that repair is not the same thing as forgiveness, and that both can be true at once. Tell me down below what you think she gave him. Was it mercy? Was it something else? I want to know, and if this story found you at the right moment, stay close. There's another one coming.